All right. Hello, everybody. Eek, 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 eek. It's great to have you here. Welcome, Ospreys. Welcome, everybody, from Neighborhood News Studio. And thank you for tuning into Neighborhood News Studio. And yeah, as John says, the show goes on all day here. So when Macduff Lives is over, stay with Neighborhood News Studio to watch their programming for the rest of the afternoon. Yeah, I find myself, you know, having to push through some conflicted feelings when I read a guy that I think, he is, as Professor Hamamoto has emphasized, he's one of the official quote unquote historian types for the deep state, I guess. I don't know if that's unfair, but it seems that way. Because at the end of his books, he seems to tie it all in together and saying, well, this is part of who we are. This is us. And these horrible things that are done by people in power in the name of America, I don't think it's us. I think it's them. I think it's the ones that are the control freaks. And most of us are not that way. Most of us are golden rule people. This country is based upon what they call traditional Judeo-Christian values, and that is the golden rule to me. If you don't follow the golden rule, then what are you doing running my government? Well, that's the big problem that we have right now, isn't it? That you want to control other people, control other countries, other races, other cultures, destroy cultures that have existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years in case of China and India and other places, just so you can assert control. And, your little life is not going to last that long compared to these ancient cultures. But once you destroy them, they're gone, like those great religious artifacts that have been destroyed in the Middle East by these so-called terrorists. The destruction of culture is bad, and unless it's a culture of death like the Nazis, which we do want to destroy, but somehow we don't seem to be able to get rid of them. So, all right, let me turn to my business for the day. We're going to continue with our reading. I want to remind you that we left off introducing Alfred Thayer Mahan, Mahan, who was the person who articulated the importance of a strong Navy. At the time that Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge were inspired to expand the United States to overseas empires and to take colonies in other countries and to dominate other lands, just exactly as we think we don't do. We're Americans. We don't do that. And those of us that have been studying this paradox, I think it's fair to say we've concentrated very much on the World War II to present time. We've also gone back to the World War I time. We've studied, Secretary of State Robert Lansing and how he's connected to the Dulles brothers. But even that is happening in the 1900s, in 1915, 1920, that era around World War I. That's about as early as we've been analyzing. But this book, I think, is very, very helpful. That's why I'm spending so much time with it, to go back and say, well, wait a minute, where did all that imperialism come from? And it comes right here in 1898. And it's a result of the combination of the wealth of the nouveau riche William Randolph Hearst with his newspaper empire and media control, and the young, wild, crazy Theodore Roosevelt. So Henry Cabot Lodge writes, the great nations are rapidly absorbing for their future expansion and their present defense all the waste places of the earth. As one of the great nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of the line of march. We have to do it too, or else we'll fall behind inevitably. So we have to have our colonies where we can control and dominate, extract the resources. That's the beginning of it. Henry Cabot Lodge, 1890s. So the country of Chile had a navy that was protecting Chilean interests against W.R. Grace and Company, who were there to extract the nitrates. That is, as Professor Hamamoto supplied, that is basically the chemical part of guano being bird droppings, a very valuable fertilizer that was discovered in the early 1800s and used all over the world, especially in the United States, to fertilize land that they'd already used up. They've used up the land on the East Coast, basically. But with fertilizer, they're able to keep growing crops. So it's a very, very important and lucrative market. Well, the Chileans weren't letting W.R. Grace get to their nitrates. That's not good. So this is the policy, is that American companies are now going to be favored, and our American muscle is going to be used to support them in the world. We continue reading from there on page 25 of the book. In 1894, the United States sent 5 warships to intervene in a civil war in Brazil, breaking a blockade that prevented the unloading of American goods at Rio de Janeiro. A year later, the United States declared its right to dictate the settlement of a boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana. These episodes produced momentary bursts of martial pride. They were practice runs, psychic preparations for the explosion of American intervention that lay ahead. Psychic preparation sounds a lot to me like predictive programming. As the presidential election of 1896 approached, 1896, I think that's the year my grandfather was born, up in Hartford, Connecticut. As the presidential election of 1896 approached, the Republican candidate, Governor William McKinley of Ohio, and hello, Ohio, was asked what the country needed in order to complete its recovery from depression. Quote, "We want a foreign market for our surplus products," unquote. That was what businessmen wanted to hear. McKinley became the first American presidential candidate to receive large campaign donations from wealthy capitalists. Many were arranged by his close friend and political manager, Mark Hanna, that's Hanna, who had made a fortune in oil, steel, coal, and railroads. Captains of industry had rarely contributed to political campaigns. Hanna persuaded them that this time they must, to block demonic power in the form of William Jennings Bryan. Remember, he's the populist, right? Few presidential candidates in American history have stirred as much emotion as Bryan. To the established classes, he was a paragon of evil, promoter of radical policies certain to destroy the American economy. Masses of the poor and dispossessed idolized him. The 1896 presidential campaign framed class conflict more starkly than any in American history. It was the first presidential election in which big money played a decisive role. At its heart was a life or death debate over free silver. Millions of Americans, especially farmers, were being crushed by debt or had already lost their land. We spoke of the dispossessed, people who are the victims of the corporate expansion that at this point owns practically all the land. Well, this was Dispossessing Farmers in the 1890s, and that was because they couldn't pay their debts. They couldn't pay their debts because they didn't have money. Well, the answer that they came up with was called free silver, and this was William Jennings Bryan's big program. Cheaper currency and easier money, they believed, would ease their burden. This they would achieve through what they called free silver, legalizing the coinage of silver at the same rate as gold, even though its intrinsic value was far less. The result would be inflation, which they presumed would raise prices for their crops and make it easier for them to pay off their debts. To creditors and many others, this sounded like a recipe for wiping out established fortunes, robbing the rich to aid the poor. Let me take a second and think about what are the dynamics of this? What are the dynamics of inflation? Because what these farmers and populists, the mass population, thought was that if they had currency, if they couldn't have any gold, right? That was the biggest problem. They didn't have any money, and gold was the money. Well, what if they could just make silver just as good as gold by passing a law that said silver and gold are the same? Then all the silver would suddenly be much more valuable than it had been in the past. The gold less valuable, but because silver was attainable, accessible to people, the common people felt that would cause their fortunes to rise, because inflated money is easier to pay debts with. And inflated prices help you make more money. That's what they thought. And on the other side, the industrialists are saying, no, you can't do that, because that will dilute the value of our established wealth. We have these great big piles of wealth where it's our family, it's our corporate existence, it's our business. This is our cash cow. This is our money. And if you dilute that money, then you're robbing me. And I'm not going to let it happen. That was the dynamic in 1898. Is that the same dynamics we're looking at right now? Because who's causing the inflation right now? Well, the inflation right now is being used by the elites to make it easier for them to pay their debts. Because all these elites, they have got tons and tons of debt. All this paper that's gone back and forth, it all represents debt. And they want to be able to pay their debts easier, just like the poor people of 1898 wanted to pay their debts easier. But it seems that the dynamics have changed, because now inflation is going to help the rich to pay their debts, but it's going to hurt the poor because they're on a fixed income. That's the difference. When you're on a fixed income, inflation kills you. If you're on a farm, if you're in a small business, if you are, in a productive activity, then the inflation may be to your benefit, because you borrow money to make product, and you make the product, you sell the product, and if the product sells for more than it would have sold for when you made it, you're making profit, and you can pay off the loan that you had to take out in order to build the factory that makes the product. So right now, we're looking at inflation that is robbing poor people, but making rich people easier to pay off their debts. It seems like things have changed to the opposite. And the thing that's different is the independent farmers, the independent producers of wealth, of income, have been taken off the table and replaced by people who need an income, a universal basic income. So if we are now on a universal basic income, then we're not protected against inflation because we're not part of the economy anymore. We're just consumers. That, I think, is something we need to think about. How is it really wise for us to put everybody on a universal income? Then that leaves the power to destroy us simply by allowing the inflation to get worse. It's something we need to think about very, very seriously, and I don't think we're thinking about it at all. So anyway, I point that out as in passing, that this is a discrepancy between the way that people viewed inflation in 1898 and the way that we look at it now. A big difference. William Jennings Bryan promoted free silver with religious fervor. He arrived at the 1896 Democratic National Convention in Chicago as a little-known former congressman from Nebraska, just 36 years old, and the most unlikely presidential candidate. In the space of less than an hour on the afternoon of July 9th, he changed the course of the convention, the campaign, and the American political history with one of the most famous speeches of the age. It was a ringing call for the Democratic Party to support, quote, the struggling masses against, quote, idle holders of idle capital, unquote. And here's his quote. There are those who believe that if you will only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak through on those below. You ever heard of trickle-down economics? Well, this is 100 years before David Stockman, okay? The Democratic idea, however, has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up through every class which rests upon them. You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, quote, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, unquote. The arena exploded. Bryan was borne through the aisles like a conquering hero. Quote, Bedlam broke loose. Delirium reigned supreme, the Washington Post reported. Less than 24 hours later, delegates nominated Bryan as the Democratic candidate for president. Wouldn't it be interesting to have a William Jennings Bryan character right now in this country? Well, without the media, he wouldn't have much chance, but it would be interesting. McKinley warned that free silver was too dangerous an experiment to try at a moment when the country was recovering from depression. Voters agreed, propelled by large sums that Hannah raised from frightened robber barons. Among them, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J. Pierpont Morgan. McKinley won the election with 271 electoral votes to 176 for Bryan. In his inaugural address, McKinley said he cherished the policy of non-interference with affairs of foreign governments, and then pointedly added, quote, we want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression, unquote. Nonetheless, his victory at the polls produced a little noticed result that decisively advanced the Imperialist cause. Lodge had campaigned for the Republican ticket, and after the election, he traveled to McKinley's home in Canton, Ohio. Isn't that interesting that McKinley's home is Canton, Ohio? Canton, the city named after Canton, the city in China where the China traders made their money. McKinley's home in Canton, Ohio, to ask, quote, one personal favor as a reward. He wanted McKinley to name Theodore Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So this is Lodge using his clout to put his man Roosevelt in a position to get what he wants, this imperial power driven by the Navy that Alfred Thayer Mayer told us we needed. Alfred Thayer Mahan, M-A-H-A-N, sorry. McKinley gave no reply. He told a friend he was hesitant because he had heard that Roosevelt was always getting into rows with everybody and might be too pugnacious for a sensitive post. Lodge did not give up. He lobbied for months, painstakingly arranging for one Washington insider after another to put in a good word with the president. Finally, McKinley relented and made the appointment. Quote, Lodge did a brilliant selling job for Roosevelt. The diplomatic historian Warren Zimmerman has written, he saw in Roosevelt the battering ram he needed to achieve a powerful navy and a muscular policy of expansion. The warmth he could not show his friends or his wife, he bestowed generously on Roosevelt. As Roosevelt clearly recognized, he owed his political success to Lodge more than anyone else, unquote. That reference to Lodge's wife was not casual. Lodge and Roosevelt came from a class of Gilded Age men who idealized women, knew little about them, and viewed romantic passion as a sign of weakness. This left Nanny Lodge unfulfilled. She was the daughter of an admiral, highly intelligent and sophisticated, who read widely, played the piano, and could recite Shakespeare at length. Quote, it was said of her that she knew the names and technical details of almost every ship in the Navy, and that she could discuss the controversies of staff and line vividly and accurately with any sea dog. Lodge never prepared a speech or essay without submitting it to her for verification. Nonetheless, the two had an uneasy relationship. Lodge said he admired Nanny for that ignorance which is born of wide knowledge, quote unquote. Talk about a left-handed compliment. It was not enough. While her husband was empire building, Nanny conducted an affair with one of his close friends, John Hay. Lodge was too busy to notice. Quote, It is unmitigated Boston that you see recorded, one of Lodge's friends wrote when he saw John Singer Sargent's portrait of the rising imperialist. Quote, the eyes of a robust, stiff-necked race of 17th and 18th century dissenters, with its plain living, high-thinking, dauntless intolerance, bleak bad manners, suppression of feeling, tenacity in its stern beliefs, and its cantankerousness stares down on you with cold disapprobation. A portrait of Henry Cabot Lodge by John Singer Sargent. Well, you see what this ties us into one of the great themes of America, which is the Puritan tradition, which is the dissenters. They dissent from the Church of England. So if they dissent from the Church of England, they should not really be pro-British, right? They should instead be pro-American, New World, the whole, we are now a whole new world, and we've put behind us all those bad things of European culture and European government. We're a new place. We're not them. We're not Europeans. We're new people, and our principles are the consent of the governed and the golden rule. Not like Europe. Europe is still into empires and kings and slavery. So a stiff-necked race of dissenters, that's the Presbyterian idea. That's the idea of we are the new world order, in a sense. We're the people that are the good people. We're the chosen ones. We are the saved, if you want to put it in, Great Awakening terms. We're saved. We're the saved ones. And that's good in the sense that you feel like we are carrying the burden of liberty, personal liberty forward, but it's bad because they were exclusive. They didn't accept the idea of other cultures, other people that didn't look like them, of being the same, unless you actually joined that rather tight-knit puritanical community. So there's a lot of stress there between what we see good in the Puritan values as opposed to what we see bad in the historical reality of Puritanism. A stiff-necked race of 17th and 18th century dissenters. Well, during 1897, Lodge and Roosevelt did all they could to promote the building of warships, expansion of naval bases, and better conditions for seamen. Nonetheless, they felt like unrecognized prophets, lonely warmongers in a country happily at peace. Lonely warmongers. At the end of the year, Roosevelt wrote that he felt, quote, a good deal disheartened at the queer lack of imperial instincts that our people show. If they did not change, he worried, quote, it will show that we have either lost or wholly lack the masterful impulse which alone can make a race great. Where does Roosevelt get all these ideas of making a race great? Well, why does he insist upon conquering other peoples as a way of proving your manhood or your masterfulness? Oh, there's an interesting article there that John is putting up. What does it say? Making biological judgment was Theodore Roosevelt the warmonger. Biographical judgments. Well, I guess he was. If you listen to what Kinzer's saying, he was a warmonger. He said there's the most glorious thing on earth is war. Roosevelt believed that. But I want to go back to one of the things that we read in the very first part, and that is that his mother and his wife died on exactly the same day in 1884. Theodore Roosevelt had married a young woman who was pregnant. And during her pregnancy, she started to have some problems, but they thought, well, maybe she just has a cold, something ill or something about her. But on the same day, now this is what's weird, okay, is that, as I understand it, Teddy Roosevelt proposed to his wife on Valentine's Day. And it was, 4 years later? It was on Valentine's Day of 1884 that she died. And not only that, but on the same day, his mother died. And he was very, very close to his mother. So, and she died of a stroke or an aneurysm, something like that. So his wife had a pre-existing condition they didn't know about involving her kidneys. His mother just had a stroke. They both happened on the same day, on February 14th of 1884. Can you imagine anything worse happening to a young man? Can you imagine anything worse? He never recovered from that. And as the biography says, he went into a state of irrepressible activity, going out to North Dakota, starting a ranch, traveling, going hunting, camping, learning how to rope like a cowboy, doing all of these crazy things to just keep his mind off of this terrible loss. And who wouldn't, But Now you look at Henry Cabot Lodge in the background behind him, and Lodge has perceived him as somebody that will be a useful battering ram, right? So historically, you have somebody behind the scenes who chooses out someone who has had a terrible tragedy in their youth, such as losing your mother or losing your father and having to support your mother. And we read about these schemes in the 20th century where young men's fathers are taken out of the picture, are killed, or the young men then become, unbeknownst to them, on this track of becoming a servitor, becoming a servant of the elites. Is that what happened to Theodore Roosevelt? Was that he was spotted? I mean, he was obvious, you didn't have to work hard to see him, but there he is, this man at sea, completely lost, but somehow turned into presidential material with a combination of the drive of a Henry Cabot Lodge and the media control of a William Randolph Hearst. So in a way, I think Theodore Roosevelt is a victim, just like all the victims of the wars that we went into. Anyway, that's just a little bit of my own reaction to what I'm reading here. To be masterful, the drive to be masterful maybe comes from the absolute lack of power that you sense when you lose your mother and your wife, because that makes you feel completely powerless. So here's a man now that's going to react by becoming as powerful as he can over other people, other places, other nations, other people's destiny. On a January night in 1898, street fighting broke out in Havana between groups favoring and opposing Cuban independence. American newspapers, eager to print whatever would excite the readers, reported falsely that Spaniards had assaulted local American citizens. "Next to war with Spain," screamed one headline. The American minister in Madrid, Stuart Woodford, was appalled. Quote, "Foreign correspondents at Havana, who are a disreputable sect, are doing all they can to raise a war scare between America and Spain, spreading no end of lies and succeeding in exciting bad feeling," he wrote to President McKinley. "In order to obtain peace, the best would be to send away some of those correspondents." In Washington, Roosevelt felt destiny calling. Combat, hearing bullets fly, just as his boyhood heroes had, was his all-consuming dream. His father had paid a substitute to fight in his place during the Civil War, and Roosevelt believed he could redeem his family's honor only by going to war himself. As soon as he heard the news of rioting in Havana, he stormed into the office of his boss, the Secretary of Navy, John Long, and announced that the moment the war was declared, he would resign his post and enlist to fight. Quote, "The impetuosity and fierceness with which he insists upon this are rather amusing," Long wrote in his diary. "I called him a crank and ridiculed him to the best of my ability, but all in vain." Soon afterward, following a long cabinet meeting at which no notes were taken, President McKinley ordered a lumbering armored cruiser docked at Key West, the USS Maine, to set sail for Havana. Officially, this would be a friendly visit. It also served as a, quote, "gunboat calling card," a sign that Uncle Sam was watching. On January 25th, the Maine dropped anchor beneath Morro Castle, a 300-year-old symbol of Spanish power, Those who wished for war saw this as a hopeful sign because it increased the possibility of confrontation. Quote, there may be an explosion any day in Cuba which would settle a great many things, unquote, Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to a friend. There may be an explosion any day, he wrote. Have you started to sense the way that I have that American history seems to be a series of false flags? You know, the Tonkin Gulf incident, was that real? Well, how many other false flags have we encountered trying to get us to go into a war? If you've run into the work of James Perloff, a historian based in Massachusetts, he studied the Boston Massacre very, very intently and carefully, and it's his belief that it's his assertion that the Boston Massacre was a false flag. Not the Boston Massacre, the shot heard round the world. Excuse me, the shot heard round the world at Lexington, and when that shot was fired and killed a British soldier, that apparently was really the first shot. But what the story was that it was the British that fired the first shot. Well, perhaps there was a Freemason with a gun hiding behind a building that nobody could see, maybe out of earshot from the rest of the militia, that could fire a shot that would hit the British and the British would react without the rest of the Americans knowing that there had been that initial shot by the American. Well, the shot heard round the world was indeed a media event. A ship was sent immediately to London to report it from the American point of view. That is, that innocent Americans were fired upon by British troops. That is the shot heard round the world. And the reason that it was important was because of all the colonies had agreed amongst themselves that an attack upon one was an attack upon all, just like NATO, right? So if they could find somebody to attack, if they could convince the other colonies that the British had attacked Massachusetts, then the other colonies would be bound by their agreement to declare war. That is the situation that seems to me to be most likely, that these, hotheads of Boston, Samuel Adams and them, that ones that did the Boston Tea Party, they engineered this so that they could have the war. This country has a lot of false flags in its history, and this one involving Remember the Maine, I think, is certainly one of them. With a Henry Cabot Lodge saying there may be an explosion any day in Cuba, quote unquote. Well, there certainly was an explosion. A radically new force in American life ensured that millions of people would feel this explosion instantly. The mass press. Literacy rates had skyrocketed just as technology made the speedy production and distribution of newspapers possible. Journalism entered a new era. With it came a hard-charging breed of cutthroat media entrepreneurs. They fought furious battles for readers, filling their pages with lurid tales of sex, crime, and scandal. The most powerful of them William Randolph Hearst, proprietor of the New York Journal, became the crucial third member of the Troika that pushed the United States into war and toward global power. These three willful men, Lodge, Roosevelt, and Hearst, joined to reshape the world. In the order of imperial battle that emerged at the beginning of 1898, Lodge was the consummate Washington insider, and Roosevelt his ever-eager public face. The two of them alone, though, could not have roused America. They needed a mighty megaphone. Hearst provided it. He used his media empire to bombard Americans with a daily barrage of super-patriotic chauvinism that drove them wild. Hearst had begun his newspaper career at the age of 24 by taking over the San Francisco Examiner from his father, who had acquired it as a settlement of a gambling debt. In 1895, he moved his base to New York and bought a failing newspaper, the Morning Journal. He built it into a powerhouse, in part by raiding the staff of its main competitor, Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Then he reduced the newsstand price to a penny. Instead of a single edition, he posted 3: morning, afternoon, and German language. To increase his reach, he bought newspapers in other cities, ultimately winding up with more than 24. Hearst's formula was simple: be the most sensational, thereby selling more papers and becoming steadily richer and more powerful. This worked phenomenally well. When Hearst bought the Journal, its daily circulation was less than 80,000. Within a year, he had pushed it close to 1 million. He called this, quote, an achievement not only unparalleled in the history of the world, but hitherto undreamed of in the realm of modern journalism. On most days, the Journal published a garish mix of stories about murder, suicide, adultery, family tragedy, and political corruption. After a while, Hearst, with an entrepreneur's sharp eye, concluded that these stories were starting to blur together. He looked for something new, a running story that would capture attention not just momentarily, but for weeks or months, and drive people to buy a newspaper every day. War is the best running story of all. It grips nations and creates a lust for news. Hearst saw that he could profit from this passion. He was, as the novelist and muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair wrote, quote, willing by deliberate and shameful lies made out of whole cloth to stir nations to enmity and drive them to murderous war. The frenetic climate in America during the late 1890s allowed Lodge, Roosevelt, and Hearst to develop breathtaking dreams. During those years, Mark Twain was living in Europe, inhaling a very different air. Lodge, Roosevelt, and Hearst considered colonialism a thrilling patriotic adventure. Twain saw it through the eyes of its victims. After visiting Hawaii, Twain wrote that white traders and missionaries there were pursuing, quote, the long, deliberate, infallible destruction of the local population. He called British-ruled Rhodesia, quote, a land of piracy and pillage, where natives suffered, quote, insult, humiliation, and forced labor for a man whose entire race the victim hates. When agitation against Tsar Nicholas II erupted in Russia, he became a founding member of the American Society of Friends of Russian Freedom. He defended the wrongfully accused Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus against charges of treason in France. In early 1898, he published a moving dispatch in Harper's describing anti-Semitic violence in Vienna and Prague. In some cases, the Germans being the rioters, in others, the Czechs, he wrote, and in all cases, the Jew had to roast, no matter which side he was on. Twain was far away when the United States set out on its imperial quest. He thought little about Cuba. Nonetheless, he was sharpening his anti-colonialism and his instinctive sympathy for the oppressed. Expansionists would never have sympathized with native Hawaiians or Africans, much less revolutionaries in Russia. Twain did. Because he was abroad during the late 1890s, he was insulated from the tumult at home. That prepared him to be more virulent in his anti-imperialism than any other American. William Randolph Hearst began his campaign for war in 1898 with wildly inflammatory coverage of the January upheaval in Havana, which the Journal portrayed as anti-American rioting, although in fact it had little to do with the United States. He had his next chance a couple of weeks later. An agent working for Cuban revolutionaries stole a letter written by the Spanish minister in Washington, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, that contained an unflattering reference to President McKinley. De Lome described him quite aptly, quote, as weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, besides being a slippery politician who tries to leave a door open behind him when keeping on good terms with the Jingos of his party, unquote. Now, Jingos means the war party, the ones that wanted to fight Spain. The Cubans, guessing that this might involve Hearst, passed the letter to him. This might interest Hearst, passed the letter to him. Quote, worst insult to the United States in its history, the Journal screamed in a front page banner on February 9th. Over the next few days, the Yellow Press exploded in its first coordinated campaign of this decisive year. Newspapers turned De Lome into a reviled symbol of Spanish impudence. The Journal said it was impossible to exaggerate the seriousness of De Lome's malevolent comment. Quickly, the indiscreet diplomat resigned. Spain formally apologized. Quickly, the, quote, Journal's letter frees country from De Lome was the Journal's headline. Flushed with this success, the Journal began demanding that McKinley immediately ask Congress for a declaration of war against Spain. It published a flood of heartrending dispatches about atrocities in Cuba, some fabricated by writers and illustrators who had never been there before. This reminds me of Wolf Blitzer in the Iraq War with his, the green screen scenes. He wasn't there. In the space of a couple of weeks, millions of Americans were whipped into an anti-Spanish fury. All they needed was another provocation. It came quickly and with devastating force. For 3 weeks after arriving at Havana, the Maine lay peacefully at anchor, a glistening white hulk with a deck the length of a football field. The warm evening of February 15th was as calm as any others. When taps sounded shortly after 9 o'clock, the captain, Charles Sigsbee, was in his cabin writing a letter to his wife. Quote, I had laid down my pen and listened to the notes of the bugle, which were singularly beautiful in the oppressive stillness of the night. I was enclosing my letter in its envelope when the explosion came. It was a bursting, rending, and crashing roar of immense volume, largely metallic in character. It was followed by heavy, ominous metallic sounds. There was a trembling and lurching motion of the vessel, a list to port. The electric lights went out. Then there was intense blackness and smoke. The situation could not be mistaken. The Maine was blown up and sinking. This was the moment for which war hawks, Jingos as they were called, had been waiting. It was tragic, but also an answer to their prayers. On February 17th, the Journal published one of the most powerfully mendacious front pages in the history of American journalism. A drawing of the Maine at anchor, showing an enemy's bomb attached to her hull below the waterline, was surrounded by brilliantly composed headlines. I think that you just had those on the screen there, my friend John, and those are the headlines. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. The Journal offered $50,000 reward for the conviction of the criminals who sent 258 Americans to death. Naval officers unanimous that the ship was destroyed on purpose. These are all lies. These are all made up by journalists, quote unquote, paid to make them up by William Randolph Hearst, who wants nothing more than a war and nothing less than a war. Officers and men tell thrilling stories of being thrown into the air amid a mass of shattered steel and exploding shells. Not everyone jumped to blame Spanish treachery. President McKinley urged Americans to withhold judgment. Secretary of the Navy Long wrote in his diary that the explosion was probably the result of an accident. The country's principal expert on maritime explosives, Philip Alger, a professor at the Naval Academy, told the Washington Evening Star that, quote, no torpedo such as known in modern warfare can of itself cause an explosion as powerful as that which destroyed the Maine, unquote. He theorized that the tragedy was caused by combustion of the ship's ordnance set off by sparks from an adjacent coal bunker. 76 years later, an official inquiry determined that he was right. Americans were in a fury, though, and in no mood for such an explanation. They seized on the Navy's false conclusion that the Maine, quote, was destroyed by a submarine mine, unquote. Investigators said they were, quote, unable to obtain evidence fixing the responsibility, but Spain was the, quote, obvious culprit. Quote, Maine is a great thing, Hearst cabled to one of his correspondents, arouse everybody. Roosevelt reacted to news of the sinking with outrage, but also immense excitement. Being a jingo, he wrote to a friend, I would give anything if President McKinley would order the fleet to Havana tomorrow. This Cuban business ought to stop. The Maine was sunk by an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards. I believe, though we shall never find out definitely, and officially it will go down as an accident. Suddenly, Cuba obsessed everyone. Crowds gathered in front of the White House. Spaniards were burned in effigy. Demands to fight echoed in editorials, speeches, and sermons. Newspapers published patriotic ditties. War songs became part of vaudeville shows. Quote, Uncle Sam, tell us why you are waiting. Hear you not the call to arms? For our noble land has been degraded. Let us wake to war's alarms. Naval planners in Washington had concluded that in case of war, their first task was to destroy the Spanish fleet to prevent a counterattack. They determined that most of the fleet was anchored at Manila Bay in the Philippines, which had been a Spanish colony for centuries. The Navy awaited an order from McKinley to attack. It did not come. McKinley was the last president to have served in the Civil War. He fought at Antietam, where more than 20,000 Americans fell in a single day. Quote, I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another, unquote, he told a friend. Several times he sought a negotiated peace in Cuba, but since he insisted that Spain renounce sovereignty over its ever-faithful isle, he could not succeed. Secretary Long also tried and failed. Long wrote in his diary that he was unable to sleep and suffered from much nervous trouble. President McKinley was no better, oppressed and careworn. Long took a day off due to his depression and muscle spasms. On February 25th, as soon as Roosevelt, his deputy, realized he was alone, he summoned his friend Lodge. Then, with Lodge at his side, he began dashing off telegrams to naval units at home and abroad. One ordered that warships be loaded with ammunition. Another authorized recruitment of new seamen. A third directed that naval cannon be prepared for action. The most important was to Admiral George Dewey, the commander of the Asiatic Squadron. Quote, order the squadron, except the paddle wheeler Monocacy, to Hong Kong, he wrote. Keep full of coal. In the event of a declaration of war with Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in the Philippine Islands, unquote. So we'll stop there today, but the point being that it was Roosevelt and Lodge that took advantage of the temporary absence of Secretary Long to send dispatches out to the Navy, getting them on a war footing and telling them their mission would be to prevent the Spanish fleet from leaving Manila Bay. And that's where we'll leave it for today. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. here at McDuff Lives on the east coast of North Carolina for our last couple days of vacation.